Okay, these are big ideas, very important ideas. And this should be a sheet that you have in your notes. Big idea 1, 2, and 3. There is a lot of overlapping with other material. And when you hear something repeated, that should be a heads up that this is something that I think is important. So big idea number 1, monitoring what students read. You have to watch out for me and my triangles. I know a triangle has 3 sides, but do you know that they really can only be, I think, either, the big side up or the small side up. And I know sometimes you might see it and it's the opposite. When we get to the reading pyramid, it'll be the opposite way. But for right now, I want you to think of it as a sieve. All right, what do you have when you have a sieve? You have something like a mesh or a net, and you put everything in there, and what you don't want goes through, and what you do want will stay in the sieve. Like if you have blackberries or blueberries, and you've just picked them, you want to wash them, so you put them in the sieve, and the dirt goes out, the water will wash it, and take away the impurities, and what you have left is what you want. Now, looking at the pyramid, if this sieve has numbers of books, you have the most books, the widest amount to choose from, broadest range at the top. You have narrow amount at the bottom. Okay, does that make sense? So for a read aloud, if I have a book that I'm reading aloud in class or a selection of books, I have the most control over what is read. I can censor, I can edit, and so there might be more books that I could read aloud to a class compared to a book list, which is the narrowest part of this triangle. There is a caution, however. You might have some eager students who enjoy what you're reading. Maybe they'll read ahead on their own. Maybe they will reread it on their own. And so much for your censoring and editing. But even still, all right, if they are astute, will realize, oh, they left this out, and obviously there's a reason. Another thing is, maybe you're reading a book aloud, and if they enjoy that book, they might read one by the same author, and that book might not be as clean or worthy. That might be a caution too. All right, read aloud. And obviously, elementary teachers, you think of them reading aloud, and parents reading aloud to their children. You know what? It's not just for little kids. When I was in college, I took, I think it was called the Teaching of Christian Ed or Teaching of Children. I think that's what it was, and it was a Christian Ed course. And our teacher would start out by reading part of a story. If it was a short story, she would read, the whole story to us. But I remember she started reading the Chronicles of Narnia, and she didn't read the whole thing. She didn't read all hour, but enough to give us a taste of the book, and we would write down some of the titles if we thought that it would be something that we could use in the future. And I was always impressed that she just took 5 or 10 minutes at the beginning of a 50-minute class period to do that, and that made an impression on me. Also, when I have substituted, even the high school English teacher in our school district, from time to time, will have a book that if the kids finish their work early, she'll pick it up and read to the students. Now, again, you always want to go through something that you're going to be reading aloud. And I found that out. I was subbing for her on a long-term basis, and I made marks. I didn't make marks in the book. Again, I used sticky notes, and I think I covered up the words that I needed to skip. So anyway, read aloud. You have more books that are probably available that you can use that would be acceptable for this. Now, the next one is in class, and there are two ways that you could use them. One is the whole class reads the same book, or maybe you have groups reading the same book, like lit circles. We've already talked about those. If you're using an in-class book, basically it's you make assignments. You're the one that figures out the schedule here, and you have activities. You cover the vocabulary, you lead the discussion, and give them the next assignment, give them quizzes and activities. And so you're using the book in class. Now, you have students who will be taking this outside of class and reading it, and so you don't have as much control. You have students doing this in a small group, but you do have some control, because if there are things in the book that you want to point out and discuss with the students, then this is your opportunity to do that. An example of this is one called No Promises in the Wind by Irene Hunt. Irene Hunt has written at least one book that I know of that has won a Newbery. And I would read this aloud to my students, but we would talk about the fact that the boys, who are the main characters, ran away from home. That is not a God-honoring activity. That's wrong to do. And it doesn't matter that, they can justify it, whatever. That is wrong. And so that's something that we definitely pointed out, and you don't just take it for granted and, whatever. So, in class. Now, the narrowest part of this triangle is the books that you will put on your book list. I have the least control over this because this book list will live forever. I still have book lists from when I was in school 40 years ago, more than 40 years ago. And students will take these away and say, oh, Mrs. Wooster had this on her book list. So that's one thing that you have to be very careful. Hopefully they are squeaky clean. Now that will vastly limit the number of books that you have available to you. One of the ways that I have found to kind of reconcile this, and that is by putting an SM by books that I want them to see me first. Now that doesn't mean that this has pornographic information. That would not be on my list. But there are some things that I want to point out to them in the book. Maybe it is No Promises in the Wind, and I want to say, you're going to enjoy this book, I'm guessing, but keep in mind that what started this whole thing is that they ran away. Look at the consequences that happen as a result of their actions. And so, see me, whether I talk to them and just say 2 minutes worth of conversation, they know that there's something that they want to have a heads up about and be alert to. So, see me is a way that I can justify putting some books on the book list that are not squeaky clean. I don't have any control over what they read outside of class, but hopefully I am teaching them standards that they will use. And I know when I taught juniors and seniors, I even used the materials from Best Books. They didn't have a copy of the book itself, but I taught them the principles so that they would have some standards to guide them. Okay, number 2, improving students' comprehension. We have before, during, and after. It's one thing to have a student just sit there with a book open and the student's eyes go across the words, but you want something to be going on in their brain. You want them to understand, and you improve comprehension by doing something before, something during, and something after, whether it's an activity or strategy. And so this is very important. It's so important that there is a PowerPoint that was so long I had to break it into 4 parts, and a sheet of notes that go with the PowerPoint. There's another sheet in your notes that is a handout, I would guess you would call this, that comes from Jim Burke's English Companion. And he has 3 columns on there of before, preparing to read, during, questioning and commenting, and then after, summarizing and synthesizing. And so he breaks down things that they can do or talk about or journal, jot notes on their reading before, during, and after. Okay, so that would be the introducing and reinforcing books from our class outline of the material that we talk about here. And we're going to be moving on to E, where it says taking a look. Now again, in the PowerPoint on BDA, before, during, and after, this is talked about, but this is at the very end of the PowerPoint, and they have verbs. And I always thought, how are my students going to remember these things? And these are so important, these comprehension strategies, that I call it taking a look. And this is my mnemonic device for using these strategies, these comprehension strategies. For summarizing, I call that looking back. You look back and summarize. For predicting, that would be looking ahead. What do you think is going to happen next? What are they going to do? All right. For making connections, which is text to self, text to text, text to world, or text to life, sometimes it's said, that's looking around. I look around at the world and make connections. I look around at other books that I can make a connection to. And this book reminds me of that, or I read something similar in another book. So looking around would be making connections. There is another sheet in your notes that is from a class that I took for continuing education to keep my license renewed. And it's on connections, making personal connections, making connections to other text, making connections to world experiences. And in this book that we used as our text, there are codes that if students make a connection, they'll just write T-S. That would be text to self connection, or T-T, text to text. T-W, that's a text to world connection. All right, and it says once students understand how to make connections, they may prefer just to use the letter C for a connection. I think T-T, T-S, T-W is probably a better way to do it, but anyway, regardless, that was something that I thought might be helpful because it gives more guidelines than just what I have here. Okay, another way of looking is to look into something. You have questions, you want to do research. I want to learn more about the Underground Railroad. And so you can look into something. And then if you're looking at something, you're evaluating it. You're studying it, and you're checking it out according to God's standards. And that's what we need to do no matter what we're doing, is to evaluate it in light of the Word of God. So we have 3 big ideas. Monitoring what students read, 3 ways that we use books. Read aloud in class and on a book list. Then there is big idea number 2, improving students' comprehension by having activities or strategies for before reading, during reading, and after reading. And big idea number 3, ideas for discussion or writing and summarizing, predicting, connecting, questioning, evaluating. So I present to you some very important ideas that you are now accountable for.